Record number 1987. Patient Julian Fane. Age at admission 47 years. Date of admission 14th August 1922. Initial diagnosis: religious psychosis with a strong paranoid component. The Blackwood Asylum engulfed Julian Fane like a ravenous organism. The afternoon not only threatened to collapse, but seemed already consumed by something invisible. The sky was not merely overcast, it was an oppressive mass, crushing everything beneath with its intangible weight. Each gust of wind was unpredictable, at times violent, at others absent, as if the very atmosphere were indecisive in its intent. When Julian arrived, reality appeared to hesitate. There was no tangible change. The smell of dampness remained nauseating, the corridors still filled with decay, but something in the air vibrated, and everyone felt it. The guards accompanying him exuded a weariness that transcended the physical. Their hands gripped the chains as if they were not restraining Julian, but trying to contain something much larger. The sound of metal scraping echoed through the corridors, growing in intensity like a lament. Julian walked in silence, yet the environment seemed to respond to his presence. Shadows stretched illogically, lights flickered in sync with his steps. The admission form was a fragile piece of paper to record something so heavy. Persecutory delusions, it said. 2 words that paled in comparison to what he truly bore. An ex-reverend, they said. Now merely a man murmuring about a spiritual portal in a monotone, hypnotic tone. His words fell like incessant drips, opened like torn flesh. His eyes were deep wells where anyone daring to look too long felt themselves drawn in. It was not merely a gaze, it was an invasion. Family accounts came as pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to assemble. Midnight sermons, beginning as whispers and transforming into guttural screams. Frantic symbols on the walls, perfect and wrong at the same time. And the singing, a continuous, low sound that filled every room. It wasn't him singing, his sister had muttered. It was something using his voice. When Julian crossed the admission room, it was as if the building held its breath. The lights flickered, but no one dared to look up. The usual sounds seemed muffled, as if the walls absorbed everything, preparing for something. He stopped in the center of the room. He did not move. He did not need to. The guards released the chains like one would release a stripped wire, and the sound of metal hitting the ground was definitive, like a full stop. Julian raised his head and looked around, but not with curiosity. It was a look of recognition, as if he were returning home. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. They never sleep. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, or perhaps he was speaking to everyone, or something. "What are you talking about?" one of the doctors ventured. His voice trembled and sweat trickled down, despite the cold that now dominated the room. Julian smiled. It was not human, not in form, but in sensation. The smile was empty, like a scar that refused to close. "You know," he replied, almost maternally, "everyone knows. They just pretend not to." The subsequent questions became irrelevant. He chose which ones to answer, discarding the rest like rubbish. "It's not the portal that matters," he said, staring at the crack in the wall. "It's what breathes on the other side." He paused, just long enough for everyone to feel the temperature drop. "You've heard it, haven't you?" As they filled out the form, the pen seemed to carve into the paper, each word heavier than the last. When the door finally closed behind him, the atmosphere did not lighten. On the contrary, a metallic smell began to permeate the air, rust mixed with something rotten. No one mentioned it. It was safer to pretend everything was fine. That night, Blackwood felt alive. In the corridors, shadows moved in impossible ways. A nurse passing by the observation room swore he heard something coming from the walls. A heavy, damp breath, as if the building were inhaling for the first time in years. Julian Fane was not just a patient. He was the key to something that Blackwood had always known was waiting. The Reverend Julian Fane, once the embodiment of virtue and leadership in his village, began his fall in a nearly imperceptible manner. It was a Sunday during the morning sermon. He started as always, firm voice, solid presence. But then he stopped. Not just a pause. It was as if something had torn the connection between him and the moment. The silence that followed was alive, oppressive. Even the creaking of the church pews seemed aggressive, as if the space itself rejected that pause. Julian's eyes fixed on nothing, a void that was not absence but an invitation to the abyss. When the authorities arrived, Julian was already quiet, sitting on the floor amidst the shards of mirror. He was laughing softly, an irregular sound that seemed to come from another place, like an echo from within himself. As he was taken out of the church, he looked directly into the void and murmured, "You think it's the end, but it's the beginning." In Asylum, Blackwood, Julian seemed at home. His eyes roamed the corridors as if reading something invisible, lingering on empty places for far too long. The doctors regarded him as an enigma, but soon they became mere pieces in a larger puzzle. The corridors around his cell began to change. The light seemed dimmer, the air heavier. Gravity itself appeared distorted. At night, the nurses would hear something, a rhythmic and constant thumping coming from the walls. Some insisted it was just the old plumbing, but others refused to comment. The smell of mold was replaced by something metallic, like oxidized blood. Julian observed everything with that vacant smile, like someone who knew something that everyone else ignored. He was not just a man, he was a catalyst, and Blackwood seemed to accept him as if he were a missing piece. Or perhaps a force that had always been there, waiting for him. The sound of a tap dripping rhythmically. Julian Fane's first days in Asylum Blackwood were not marked by the agitation the doctors expected, but by a suffocating calm, almost unbearable. His obedience to the routines was mechanical, as if he were merely following an invisible script. He answered questions with disconcerting clarity, but his words carried a weight that no one knew how to interpret. What made him more unsettling, however, was his gaze, a gaze that seemed to penetrate bodies, walls, and at times reality itself. Mornings began with the sharp bell calling the patients to the dining hall. For everyone, it was just a sound, something that signaled another monotonous day. For Julian, it was something more. He would freeze for a few seconds whenever the bell rang, his eyes half closed as if trying to hear something beyond the sound. Once, he murmured, almost to himself, "The frequency is wrong, it doesn't break. Do you feel that?" His voice was so low it seemed to be whispered directly into the bones of those nearby. The doctors noted the comment but avoided discussing it. It was safer to pretend they hadn't heard. Blackwood seemed to mold itself to Julian's presence, or perhaps it was the other way around. The walls felt closer, the corridors more claustrophobic. Even the air seemed different, charged with an invisible density. Julian noticed this immediately. He ran his fingertips along the cracks in the walls with a reverence that made the nurses avoid looking. "They breathe," he said once, his eyes fixed on something beyond the surface. "It's not air, it's something greater." He was placed in a room on the second floor where sunlight was merely a memory. The bars on the windows cast long, intricate shadows across the walls. A guard commented, trying to lighten the atmosphere, "They're for your protection." Julian let out a low laugh, an irregular and dry sound that made the guard step back. "They're not for me. They're for them." During moments of rest, while the other patients sank into incoherent murmurs, Julian drew. His pencils glided across the paper in spirals and patterns that seemed to writhe, as if trying to escape. A doctor, intrigued, asked what they meant. Julian slowly lifted his eyes and replied, his voice emotionless, "They are maps, for those who know how to read them." In the second week, the change began. Julian became more distant, but the environment around him seemed to react. Patients who had never spoken began to scream when he passed by. A man who compulsively drew human faces started tearing up the paper until he punctured it upon seeing Julian. The doctors dismissed it as coincidence, but the nurses did not. One of them noted in her report, "There's something about him, something that isn't him." In the third week, a nurse found him kneeling in the center of his room. The door was ajar, but the silence inside was so absolute it felt like a barrier. When she called to him, he did not react. As she approached, Julian turned slowly. His eyes were wells of emptiness, and the smile he managed was small but wrong, as if it had been placed there by someone else. "They are coming," he whispered. But they never left. Julian was visibly thinner. It wasn't hunger, he ate regularly. It was as if something was being drained from him, or perhaps something was growing inside. His hands trembled constantly, and his eyes, though open, seemed fixed on something that no one else could see. Those who looked at him for too long reported a tightness in their chest, as if they were being pulled to a place where they shouldn't be. Blackwood himself seemed to be getting ill. The doors creaked incessantly, even when closed. The smell of damp became almost unbearable, especially near Julian's room. Nurses began to report inexplicable sounds, rustlings like wings, whispers coming from the walls. Some heard footsteps that stopped abruptly before turning around. Others preferred not to comment. Julian appeared indifferent. "The veil is thinner here," he told the psychiatrist in one of their sessions. "That's why I'm here. It's not for me, it's for them. This place is the edge of a map, and those who see the edge," he paused, smiling as if he were hearing a private joke, "also see what lies beyond." That night, the psychiatrist confided to a colleague, "Something about him. It's as if he's studying us, not the other way around, and that frightens me." The colleague, pale, did not respond. Julian Fane was not just a patient, he was merging with the asylum, and somehow the building seemed eager to receive him. The sound of indistinct murmurs emerging from the walls. Julian Fane's deterioration was like a contagious disease that not only consumed his mind but also infected the very environment of Blackwood Asylum. He no longer responded to the alienists' questions, not out of resistance or disinterest, but because he seemed to be beyond language. When someone spoke to him, it was like shouting into the void, a void that responded not with echoes, but with an oppressive presence that suffocated everyone around. He would spend hours standing still, like a statue, in the center of his room or in a dark corner of the dining hall, his eyes fixed on something invisible, yet terribly tangible. The air around him felt denser, charged with an energy that made the lungs work overtime. Nurses avoided staying close to him for long, but even at a distance, they felt his presence, like a weight on their chest. The incidents began small. One nurse, delivering breakfast, froze the moment she entered the room. Julian, without moving, said, "You saw it too. They are watching us." The tray fell from her hands, the sound reverberating like a gunshot down the corridors. She requested a transfer that same day, but the impression he left lingered. The other patients reacted to Julian in ways that the doctors tried to rationalize, but which did not fit into their theories. A violent inmate suddenly became inert, refusing to even look in Julian's direction. Another, who had never uttered a word, began to murmur incessantly a monotonous, repetitive melody whenever Julian was nearby, as if trying to silence something that terrified him. "He's not alone," whispered a nurse during a shift change. "It's as if something walks with him." The walls began to change. It was not something that could be measured or recorded, but everyone felt it. The cracks seemed deeper, the corridors tighter, the air heavier. A doctor, during a routine assessment, described Julian's room as a sick lung. The air felt poisoned, as if expelled by something alive but decomposing. He left in a hurry, sweating, refusing to speak about what he felt. In an attempt to bring him back to routine, the doctors arranged a group session. The room was silent, except for the usual murmurs of the patients. Julian, until then motionless, lifted his eyes and fixed them on the chief alienist. "You know, don't you?" he said, in a tone that seemed to resonate deeper than the human voice should reach. "They have always been here. This place is not a hospital. It is a gate." The murmur in the room changed. It was no longer the patients, it was the building. A low, constant hum grew in the walls, like a collective breathing. The alienist tried to interrupt it, ordering silence, but Julian smiled. It was not a human smile. It was a fissure on his face, something that did not match his usual expression. "You can silence my voice, but you cannot silence them." That night, a scream broke the silence of the asylum. A nurse found Julian kneeling on the floor of his room, his bloodied nails scratching intricate circles into the floor. The patterns were so complex that it seemed impossible for anyone to have drawn them by hand. When asked, Julian raised his face, his eyes now completely hollow, like black holes. "It's the map. If I stop, they will come out. Do you want them to come out?" The next morning, a patient was found dead in his cell. There were no signs of violence, but his hands covered his face in a futile attempt to protect himself from something. The frozen eyes of the corpse captured absolute terror. When Julian was informed, he simply laughed, an irregular sound devoid of warmth. He saw, he said, and couldn't take it. The climax came during a routine inspection. Nurses found him standing before a crack in the wall of his room. He was murmuring something in a language no one recognized, his fingers touching the crack as if trying to open the surface. One of the nurses, against the warnings of his colleagues, touched the crack as well. The moment he did, everyone in the room felt a low vibration, a reverberation that seemed to come from the foundations of the building. The nurse recoiled, pale, murmuring incoherent words before running out. He was never seen again. Julian slowly turned to the alienists who were observing. "Now you understand," he said, with an almost paternal serenity. "It's not about me. It never was. It's about them. And what is coming." That night, the entire asylum seemed to breathe heavily. The sound in the walls grew more intense, an irregular pulsing that filled every corridor, every room. The lights flickered as if something were draining their energy. Patients screamed or murmured in unison, forming a cacophony that no one could explain. Julian Fane had ceased to be a man. He was now the center of something that the asylum seemed to have been waiting for a long time. The building did not contain him, it amplified him. Together, they were one. Since the early days in Blackwood, Julian Fane harbored an obsession that seemed to sculpt the very air around him. His presence was not just perceived, it was felt, like a low and constant sound that no one could locate, but that made the chest tighten. During his first evaluation, when asked about his perception of reality, he slowly tilted his head. A thin, unsettling, vacant smile appeared on his lips. "Reality is wearing thin," he murmured, each word like a blade sliding across the skin. "Don't you feel it? Like a fabric that has been stretched too much, about to tear." At first, the doctors tried to frame his behavior within known diagnoses, but Julian transcended any clinical explanation. He smoothed cracks in the walls with his fingers, tracing invisible patterns in the air as if he were drawing maps that only he could see. When asked, he rarely responded, limiting himself to saying with a disturbing calm, "They are here. They always have been." These words, spoken without emphasis, seemed to weigh on the environment, making every room he passed through darker, more suffocating. The other patients began to react in ways that no medical manual could predict. A woman, catatonic for years, let out a sharp scream upon seeing him pass, her eyes wide open, fixed on something behind him. Another patient, who lived in seclusion, began to avoid areas near Julian's room, repeatedly murmuring, "It's with him. He brought it. I know it's here." The doctors noted the events as mere coincidence, but the nurses whispered among themselves, "It's not just him. There's something more. Something that came with him." The asylum began to change. They were not obvious changes, but everyone felt it. The walls seemed closer, the corridors longer and darker. The shadows, once harmless, now seemed to carry weight. Julian appeared to notice these changes before anyone else. He refused to sit in the break room, remaining standing in a corner, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing on the walls. "There," he once said, pointing to a specific corner, "that's where it begins. When no one is watching, they move." The next morning, a crack appeared, exactly where he had pointed, long and deep like a fresh cut. During an evaluation, Julian was asked about the drawings he made compulsively, spirals, geometric symbols that seemed to twist upon themselves. When the doctor asked what they meant, he slowly raised his eyes. "Portals," he replied simply. "This place is full of them, don't you see? Every crack, every shadow. This building is a map. I'm just trying to remember how to read it." The nights at Blackwood became unbearable. Nurses began to report whispers coming from Julian's room, but when they opened the door, he was fast asleep. The lights in the corridor flickered incessantly, and the shadows they cast seemed denser, more defined. During one of those nights, a guard swore he heard Julian murmuring in his sleep, "It's coming. You will see. Everyone will see." On the coldest night of winter, the dining hall became the scene of something no one would ever forget. Julian stopped eating, his posture rigid. He stared intently at a point on the table as silence spread like a plague. Then he spoke, his voice low but laden with something that made the bones tremble. "Something has opened up here. You can feel it, can't you? It is with us now." Some inmates began to scream, others recoiled, pressing their hands against their ears as if trying to block an inaudible sound. The alienists took notes, but it was clear they were also affected. One of them recorded, "Fane is not just a man, he is a point of convergence, a catalyst. The air around him feels heavier. He brings something with him, and this place seems to recognize him." Julian did not seem disturbed. In fact, he was calm, almost satisfied, as if he were the center of something that was finally taking shape. One of the doctors, in a low tone, remarked, "He knows. He knows something we do not, and that makes him at peace." The building seemed increasingly aware. Creaks and cracks, once random, now had a rhythm, almost like breathing. Shadows moved in ways that defied the light. The whispers, once sparse, became constant. They were more than murmurs, they were muffled screams, as if something in the foundations was trying to escape. On the last documented night, the wind in the corridors became a continuous howl. Julian stood in the center of his room, whispering words in a language no one recognized. When the nurses entered to contain him, he turned, his eyes deep and inhuman, and said, "The fabric has torn. They are already here." The lights went out completely. The entire building trembled, and for a moment it felt as though the asylum was breathing. When the lights came back on, Julian was motionless, a pale smile on his lips. "You have heard it, haven't you? You are finally listening." In that moment, everyone realized Julian was not bringing something to Blackwood. He was the portal, and Blackwood was ready to open itself to what awaited it. A sound of indistinct murmurs floated through the air. Julian Fane's deterioration became a suffocating spectacle, impossible to ignore, an implosion that not only consumed itself but also infected the very asylum of Blackwood. What remained of his lucidity evaporated like mist in the sun, leaving behind a vacuum filled with murmurs and invisible presences. He walked the corridors like a man trapped between two worlds, stopping abruptly, tilting his head as if listening to a discussion behind closed doors. "They are still deciding," he said in a casual tone, almost amused. "They don't know if it's the right time." The alienists, once confident in their theories, began to hesitate. Their reports on Julian reflected more questions than answers. He spoke of physical sensations that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. "The walls breathe," he murmured on one occasion, his fingers gliding along the concrete cracks as if touching living flesh. "But it's not air. It's not air. I feel it." His movements grew spasmodic, as if he were warding off something invisible, repelling presences that only he could perceive. The nights in Blackwood turned into a hell of wakefulness. Nurses reported hearing heavy footsteps coming from Julian's room, yet when they opened the door, he was always motionless, lying in bed, eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling. Others heard guttural murmurs, not from Julian but from the very walls, as if the building were trying to speak. A guard passing through the corridor one night was gripped by a sudden chill, his lungs releasing steam in white clouds. He swore that Julian whispered something that night, even though he was alone. "You are not alone," the man repeated, his voice trembling. Julian's utterances, once dismissed as delusions, began to echo uncomfortably concretely. "If I close my eyes," he said in one of the rare moments he spoke with the doctors, "they will get me. They are waiting for the darkness." The other inmates, once apathetic, now reacted with palpable fear. A woman, known for her bouts of paranoia, let out a shrill scream upon seeing him, frantically pointing at the shadows around her. "It's there," she cried, in a voice that cut through the nerves of those listening. "It's there with him." Another inmate, who spent his days drawing human faces, began to compulsively destroy his works, murmuring, "They've changed. The faces are wrong now. They're all wrong." Even the building seemed to respond to Julian's presence. The corridors he traversed acquired a strange, undulating quality, like a reflection in still water. A metallic and thick smell, something between blood and rust, lingered in the air around his room. permeating the clothes and nostrils of those who approached. Julian seemed to relish it. "They're closer now," he whispered, with his eyes half closed, as if he could see them through the walls. "Don't you feel it? It's getting stronger." In the fourth week, Julian's final collapse shook Blackwood to its foundations. He was found kneeling in the center of his room, his hands pressed against the walls, the concrete scratched down to the bone of his fingers. The corridor lights flickered, stuttering like an arrhythmic heart, and a guttural, deep, vibrating sound began to reverberate through the building's foundations. When the nurses opened the door, Julian slowly turned his face. His smile was wide and grotesque, as if something inside him were trying to escape. "Did you feel it?" he asked, his voice chillingly calm as blood trickled down his broken nails. "They're coming. It's beginning." That night, the wind, always a subtle whisper in Blackwood, became a continuous howl, slicing through the corridors like a desperate warning. The doctors sedated him. But what happened that night left permanent scars on all who were present. The temperature in Julian's room remained below zero for hours, even after his transfer. The surrounding corridors fell into a silence so absolute that it felt unnatural, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Julian's delirium began to take shape. What had once been whispers now became muffled screams, tearing through the silence like claws on concrete. The walls pulsed with an almost imperceptible movement, as if something living were trying to break free. The entire building seemed to react to Julian's presence, no longer as a patient, but as an epicenter. On the last recorded night, the air in Blackwood became nearly impossible to breathe. The wind ceased, and in the absolute silence, the sound of something scratching at the building's foundations could be heard. Julian, now completely still, looked at the alienists watching from afar and smiled. "They are here," he said, his voice low but impossible to ignore. "You finally brought them." And then Blackwood trembled. It was not the crumbling building, but something deeper, something primordial. What Julian Fane had brought with him was now part of the building. And somehow, everyone knew, there was no way to escape. Blackwood was no longer just an asylum, it had become a portal. And it had opened. In the weeks leading up to Julian Fane's collapse, Asylum Blackwood ceased to be merely a place. It became an extension of something greater, something alive. Julian's presence had saturated the environment like a disease that did not confine itself to the body, but corroded the space around it. The alienists, once confident in their theories, began to hesitate. Their reports on Julian reflected more questions than answers. He spoke of physical sensations that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. "The walls breathe," he murmured on one occasion, his fingers gliding along the concrete cracks as if touching living flesh. "But it's not air. It's not air. I feel it." His movements grew spasmodic, as if he were warding off something invisible, repelling presences that only he could perceive. The nights in Blackwood turned into a hell of wakefulness. Nurses reported hearing heavy footsteps coming from Julian's room, yet when they opened the door, he was always motionless, lying in bed, eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling. Others heard guttural murmurs, not from Julian but from the very walls, as if the building were trying to speak. A guard passing through the corridor one night was gripped by a sudden chill, his lungs releasing steam in white clouds. He swore that Julian whispered something that night, even though he was alone. "You are not alone," the man repeated, his voice trembling. Julian's utterances, once dismissed as delusions, began to echo uncomfortably concretely. "If I close my eyes," he said in one of the rare moments he spoke with the doctors, "they will get me. They are waiting for the darkness." The other inmates, once apathetic, now reacted with palpable fear. A woman, known for her bouts of paranoia, let out a shrill scream upon seeing him, frantically pointing at the shadows around her. "It's there," she cried, in a voice that cut through the nerves of those listening. "It's there with him." Another inmate, who spent his days drawing human faces, began to compulsively destroy his works, murmuring, "They've changed. The faces are wrong now. They're all wrong." Even the building seemed to respond to Julian's presence. The corridors he traversed acquired a strange, undulating quality, like a reflection in still water. A metallic and thick smell, something between blood and rust, lingered in the air around his room, permeating the clothes and nostrils of those who approached. Julian seemed to relish it. "They're closer now," he whispered, with his eyes half closed, as if he could see them through the walls. "Don't you feel it? It's getting stronger." In the fourth week, Julian's final collapse shook Blackwood to its foundations. He was found kneeling in the center of his room, his hands pressed against the walls, the concrete scratched down to the bone of his fingers. The corridor lights flickered, stuttering like an arrhythmic heart, and a guttural, deep, vibrating sound began to reverberate through the building's foundations. When the nurses opened the door, Julian slowly turned his face. His smile was wide and grotesque, as if something inside him were trying to escape. "Did you feel it?" he asked, his voice chillingly calm as blood trickled down his broken nails. "They're coming. It's beginning." That night, the wind, always a subtle whisper in Blackwood, became a continuous howl, slicing through the corridors like a desperate warning. The doctors sedated him. But what happened that night left permanent scars on all who were present. The temperature in Julian's room remained below zero for hours, even after his transfer. The surrounding corridors fell into a silence so absolute that it felt unnatural, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Julian's delirium began to take shape. What had once been whispers now became muffled screams, tearing through the silence like claws on concrete. The walls pulsed with an almost imperceptible movement, as if something living were trying to break free. The entire building seemed to react to Julian's presence, no longer as a patient, but as an epicenter. On the last recorded night, the air in Blackwood became nearly impossible to breathe. The wind ceased, and in the absolute silence, the sound of something scratching at the building's foundations could be heard. Julian, now completely still, looked at the alienists watching from afar and smiled. "They are here," he said, his voice low but impossible to ignore. "You finally brought them." And then Blackwood trembled. It was not the crumbling building, but something deeper, something primordial. What Julian Fane had brought with him was now part of the building. And somehow everyone knew there was no way to escape. Blackwood was no longer just an asylum. It had become a portal, and it had opened. In the weeks leading up to Julian Fane's collapse, Asylum Blackwood ceased to be merely a place. It became an extension of something greater, something alive. Julian's presence had saturated the environment like a disease that did not confine itself to the body but corroded the space around it. The temperature, frigid like the breath of something malevolent, made each exhalation of the staff form white clouds, while the building plunged into an unnatural silence. It was not the common absence of noise, it was a void that sucked in even the subtlest echoes, as if the very space awaited something terrible. When chaos began, it was not with physical violence, but with an overwhelming, invisible force that seemed to bend the environment around it. Julian was found crouched in the corner of his room, his face hidden between his knees. He was whispering incessantly, but the sounds did not come solely from his mouth. The nurses hesitated before entering, feeling a pressure that seemed to emanate from the closed door. When they finally opened it, they perceived something impossible. The whisper echoed from the walls and the floor, a cacophony of voices that seemed to repeat his words in different tones and intensities. One of the nurses, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, knelt beside him. The moment he leaned in to listen, he recoiled as if struck by a shock, knocking over a chair. "It wasn't his voice," he murmured later, his expression frozen in terror. There were many voices, deep, high-pitched, and they wouldn't stop. When they tried to calm him, Julian slowly lifted his face. The smile on his lips was not human, it was an empty arc, like the stroke of an artist who had lost control. His eyes seemed too deep, like abysses that pulled in anyone who dared to gaze into them. "You don't understand," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "They are already here. I am just the beginning." The corridor lights began to flicker, but not randomly. The pattern was rhythmic, a code that no one could decipher, yet it made the nerves of those watching burn with anxiety. One staff member, crossing the corridor, stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection showed something that shouldn't be there, an indistinct shadow moving behind him. He turned quickly, but the corridor was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the shadow had also vanished. In the asylum, nothing remained static. Patients began to react in extreme ways to Julian's presence. Some refused to eat or leave their cells when they knew he was in the cafeteria. Others, previously catatonic, began to imitate his gestures and murmurs. One patient started banging his head against the wall, frantically repeating, "It's coming." He called, and now it is coming. The staff, increasingly exhausted, began to avoid Julian. A doctor described his experience upon entering the room as a disconnection from reality. He reported constant chills, accompanied by a pressure in his chest that made breathing difficult. "It's as if that space was not made for me," he said, his words laden with a terror that could not be disguised. The point of no return occurred during a routine inspection. The nurses found Julian's room completely transformed. The bed was precariously propped against the wall, the chairs were turned upside down, and the sheets had been torn into thin strips, tied in geometric patterns that seemed to pulse when viewed for too long. In the center of the room, Julian sat, his hands bloodied and covered in deep scratches, yet his face displayed a disturbing serenity. He slowly raised his eyes and spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You will never understand. This place is not a hospital. It is a door, and now it is open." That night, an inhuman scream echoed through the corridors, pulling the patients from their beds and freezing the staff in place. It was not a human sound. It was something between a lament and a roar, laden with a pain and fury that felt ancient, as if it came from the depths of the building itself. The lights flickered in sync with the scream, while a metallic and acrid smell, like rusted blood, permeated the air. In the medical records, the event was noted as an unexplained incident. But among those present, there was no doubt. Something was changing. When the nurses re-entered Julian's room, they found him sitting still, as if the chaos around him had nothing to do with him. But the walls were marked with symbols burned into the stone, the edges still warm to the touch. The shapes seemed to writhe under the gaze of those present, defying logic and reason. Julian smiled again, a smile that no one could endure for long, and said with unsettling calmness, "They are closer. You can feel it now, can't you?" What followed was never officially recorded, but that night, the Blackwood Asylum became something different. It was no longer just a decaying building housing lost souls. It was a catalyst, a portal that Julian had opened. And everyone, patients or staff, knew nothing that was about to happen would be humane. Julian Fane's final weeks at Asylum Blackwood transcended any logical explanation, challenging the very sanity of those around him. On the morning following the final incident, Julian entered a state of catatonia. To the doctors, it seemed the inevitable conclusion of a mind that had collapsed under its own weight. But to the nurses, there was something more. An unsettling feeling that this was not the end. He did not move, did not respond to any stimuli, but his lips maintained that enigmatic smile, a smile that seemed to carry secrets buried in a place no one else could reach. His hands, rigid and intertwined in an unusual manner, often reached towards the cracks in the walls. Even motionless, there appeared to be a constant communication around him, as if he were sending and receiving messages from something invisible. The patients, who once screamed at the sight of him, now murmured disjointed phrases, fragments of thoughts echoing what Julian had already said. "It's open," one whispered. "The cracks, the map. He lives." In an attempt to understand his state, the doctors decided to transfer him to another wing, away from the other patients. But when the plan was put into action, Asylum Blackwood seemed to react. The lights flickered throughout the building, plunging the corridors into intermittent darkness, punctuated by irregular flashes. In the midst of the gloom, a sound echoed that no one could identify. A chorus of voices, deep and high, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very fabric of the building itself. When the nurses returned to Julian's room, they found him motionless. He was lying on his back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He was no longer breathing. However, the smile remained, now eternal, frozen like a signature of something incomprehensible. It was not peace, it was triumph. The medical record noted sudden heart failure as the official cause of death, but the state of Julian's room told a very different story. The furniture was in impossible positions. chairs that seemed to have been pushed into the walls, a table that tilted slightly on one of its legs as if something invisible was still moving it. The walls were marked with symbols burnt into the stone, their edges still warm, radiating a heat that seemed to pulse. When a doctor tried to reproduce them on paper, his hand trembled so much that he abandoned the effort. That night, a cold wind swept through the corridors, even with all the windows locked. The sound was not that of a common draft, but something that felt irregular, rhythmic, almost like a breath drawing near and then receding. Julian Fane was officially declared dead, but among the staff and residents of the asylum, death did not bring relief. On the contrary, it seemed to amplify whatever was happening there. Many began to have recurring dreams, visions of the burnt symbols in Julian's room, moving in patterns that defied logic. Others awoke with the sensation of being watched, their eyes frantically searching for something they never found. The electrical failures, inexplicable noises, and temperature changes continued weeks after his death. The corridor leading to the room where Julian had stayed became a place to be avoided. The lights flickered incessantly, and a faint metallic smell permeated the air no matter how many times it was cleaned. Some nurses refused to work in that wing, claiming to feel a constant presence, as if invisible eyes were following their every step. The case was officially closed, but among those who revisited the events, a disturbing consensus emerged. The fear came not only from what had happened, but from what continued to happen. Blackwood was no longer just an old building. It seemed to pulse with an energy that no one knew how to contain, an energy that had been awakened by Julian Fane and now lay in wait. Stories like this are not merely memories, say those who dare to speak of Julian Fane. They are like shadows. They linger, lurking at the edge of what we consider real. If you have the courage to explore the secrets of Asylum Blackwood and uncover what truly happened in Julian Fane's final weeks, sign up now. But be warned, some doors once opened can never be closed. Not everything you find will be easy to forget.